My name is Naomi Vale, and the night my neighbor called the police to report my illegal business, he stood at the edge of his driveway smiling like a man who thought public embarrassment was a form of property ownership. That smile mattered. 'Cause men like Derek Morrow do not just want to win. They want witnesses. They want a crowd. A lesson. A moment where the whole street sees that your independence was temporary and their suspicion was right all along. He did not get that moment. He got something much worse. He got attention. I was 36, divorced, and living alone in a renovated corner house with a detached rear studio where I restored vintage leather goods for private clients. Old trunks, designer bags, military cases, film wardrobe pieces, heirloom travel sets. The sort of work that doesn't attract much noise but does attract a certain kind of money. It was appointment only. Quiet. Documented. Licensed. Profitable. And for reasons that only the lonely and controlling truly understand, that combination offended my neighbor on a spiritual level. His name was Derek Morrow. 55, stocky build. Permanent squint. Kind of suburban man who carries himself like the elected sheriff of a street that never actually voted. He had opinions about everything: parking, hedges, recycling bins, contractor trucks, delivery hours, music, dogs, youth, noise, weather, and especially women who lived alone without asking the block for permission to thrive. He first complained about parking 6 months after I moved in. Then deliveries. Then commercial traffic. Then industrial smells, which was absurd because leather conditioner smells more expensive than half the houses on that street. The first time he knocked on my door about the business, I showed him my permit. He stared at it for a full 3 seconds, then said, "Permits don't mean people have to like it." That sentence told me everything. He did not want order. He wanted obedience. The business itself had been built slowly. After my divorce, I took the one skill I had always treated as a private art, restoration, and turned it into something sustainable. I apprenticed informally under an old leather conservator for a year, learned how to price quietly, built a discreet client list, and grew the kind of reputation that travels among wealthy people not because they advertise it but because they want someone trustworthy enough to hand old stories to. That part mattered to me. I was not just fixing bags or travel cases. I was preserving memory. My studio was clean, warm, and quiet. Shelves of oils and conditioners. Brass hooks. A heavy central work table. Proper ventilation. Inventory logs. Insurance. Tax registration. Before every year ended, I sat with a binder and updated every permit personally. 'Cause if you are a woman running something alone, the world trains you to make paperwork part of your self-defense. And Derek Morrow, for all his surveillance, never understood that. Or maybe he did. Maybe that was why he hated me so much. 'Cause a woman who cannot be caught messy is difficult to dominate. At first, Derek's harassment was irritating in a manageable way. He would stand in his garage with the door half open pretending to sort tools while watching my clients come and go. He photographed delivery vans. Once, he actually stepped onto the sidewalk to ask a woman dropping off an antique trunk whether she really knew what was going on back there. I filed a city harassment note after that. Not because I was frightened. 'Cause ugly behavior hardens when it goes undocumented. The city officer on the phone sounded bored. "Has he threatened you?" "Not directly." "Then we'll log it." "Log it carefully," I said. That made him pause. "I intend to," he replied. "Good." I had learned years earlier that the difference between surviving a bad situation and getting swallowed by one often comes down to whether there is a paper trail before the explosion. Over the months, Derek escalated in small ways. He complained to the neighborhood app that my house looked commercial. He told another neighbor I was probably running inventory off the books. He once muttered loudly enough for me to hear that single women with workshops usually meant trouble. I ignored most of it publicly. Privately, I kept notes, dates, times, witnesses, language used, photos if needed. People misunderstand women like me. They think calm means passive. No. Calm means memory under control. The street itself was one of those older suburban lanes trying very hard to preserve a fantasy of itself. Wide sidewalks, modest but expensive houses, mature trees, people who believed they were too respectable for real ugliness, which mostly meant they preferred it subtle and local. There were decent people on that block. Mrs. Caro on the opposite side, who liked my roses and always waved. A young couple renting near the corner who minded their business and minded it well. A retired teacher with a basset hound and a talent for pretending not to notice gossip. But the social gravity of the street bent around Derek because men like him are exhausting enough that people mistake appeasement for peace. Then his wife left him. That changed everything. I never knew exactly why she left, and frankly I didn't need to. But after she moved out, the surveillance became more aggressive. He spent longer in the garage. He started backing trucks in late at night. There were metallic noises after midnight sometimes. Heavy scraping. Load clanks. The sort of sounds you notice and file away even before you know why. One evening, as I was locking the studio, he called across the fence. "What exactly do you tell the tax people you do back there?" I turned slowly. "I tell them the truth." He smiled, that thin, ugly smile of his. "That'll be refreshing for somebody." That line sat in my stomach all night. Not because it was sharp. 'Cause it was preparatory. He was building something. You can tell when a man like Derek is winding up to weaponize official attention. Their language changes first. They stop merely criticizing and start implying unseen crimes. They test how the accusations sound in daylight before they take them to someone with a badge. I doubled my records after that. Inventory updated nightly. Client appointments time-stamped. Receipts reconciled. Permits reprinted. Insurance rider copied. Photo log of the workspace. Then 2 weeks later he got his chance. Or thought he did. It was raining that night. Not hard, but steadily enough that the street looked lacquered and every porch light reflected twice. I was in the studio restoring a 1960s chestnut leather travel case for a retired actress who trusted me because I never photographed clients' belongings and never asked questions about the lives attached to them. I was halfway through edge conditioning when headlights washed across the front of the house. Then red and blue. 3 patrol cars. For 1 suspended second, the room went perfectly silent except for the rain against the studio roof and the low motor hum of the ventilation unit. Then I understood. Derek. Of course. I set down the brush carefully, removed my gloves 1 finger at a time, and walked through the kitchen toward the front door. Through the side window I saw him, standing exactly where I knew he would be. At the edge of his driveway, arms folded, trying to look merely curious and failing because satisfaction was already all over him. That told me this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a performance. A police officer knocked. I opened the door in my apron, dark-fitted shirt and work trousers, with the smell of leather oil still on me and enough calm in my face to make the younger officer blink. "Miss Vale?" the older one asked. "Yes. We received a report of a possible illegal commercial operation involving undeclared high-value inventory and potentially stolen goods. I looked at him for 2 full seconds. Then I stepped aside and said, "Please come in." That surprised them. Good. People with something to hide often hesitate. People like Derek count on hesitation. Instead, I let them into a spotless front room with tax files within reach and permit copies already in a drawer near the hall. The older officer introduced himself as Officer Reyes, mid-40s, dark hair going silver at the edges, calm eyes. The younger one hovered near the entry while the third remained outside. "Who made the report?" I asked. Reyes didn't answer directly, but he did glance toward the front window. That was answer enough. I almost smiled. "Would you like the permit first, the tax registration, or the client inventory binder?" The younger officer blinked. Reyes looked at me with the first flicker of professional interest. "The permit," he said. I handed it over. Then the registration. Then the insurance rider. Then the inventory ledger. Then appointment records. Everything aligned. Everything dated. Everything clean. Everything irritatingly legitimate. By the time we reached the workshop, the younger officer had started looking embarrassed. I didn't blame him. There is a special discomfort in realizing you have been invited into a woman's home because a bitter man across the street wants to make suspicion feel official. Reyes moved slowly through the studio. His gaze took in the shelves, tagged client items, labeled restoration steps, the humidity monitor, the secured cabinet, the finished invoices clipped by month. "Do you run all of this alone?" he asked. "Yes." "You have anyone else working here?" "No." He nodded. Then, as he turned toward the back window, he stopped. "What's in his garage?" I followed his line of sight. Derek's garage door was half open. Inside, behind a stack of paint cans and some yard equipment, I could see 3 plastic crates on a metal shelving rack. One of them was cracked along the side just enough to expose silver-gray shapes stacked inside. Catalytic converters. Even from my window, I could see the rough grind marks where identifying surfaces had been scraped. Something in Reyes's face changed. Not dramatic. Not for civilians. But I saw it. A professional seeing the wrong story collapse. He asked without looking away from the window. "Has he been receiving deliveries at night?" I thought of the backed-in vans. Clanging. The metal shift sounds after midnight. "Yes," I said. "How often?" Enough that I noticed. That was all he needed. He stepped aside and spoke quietly into his shoulder radio. And with that, Derek Morrow's favorite fantasy on the street stopped being mine. What happened next is one of the few moments in my life where I can say, honestly and without shame, that justice was beautiful. Not because it was loud. 'Cause it was deserved. Reyes and the other officers crossed the street. Derek saw them coming and immediately became exactly the man I suspected he had always been when real scrutiny turned around on him. Loud. Fended. Performative. "You can't just come over here," he shouted. "I called about her." That line should be studied. 'Cause it contains the whole psychology of men like him. He believed accusation was directional. He believed official suspicion could be aimed like a flashlight and never widen. He believed if he brought authority onto the block, it would stop exactly where he pointed. Officer Reyes said the most satisfying sentence I have ever heard from a public servant. "You brought us here." I stood in my doorway, rain behind the porch light, and watched the whole thing unfold. The officers moved into the garage. Derek kept talking. His voice got shriller the more they ignored him. One of the crates was pulled forward. Then another. Then a power tool case. Then a cardboard box of cut invoices and handwritten delivery slips. Reyes emerged briefly, looked toward the third officer, and gave a sharp nod. A second patrol unit rolled in less than 10 minutes later. That's when the neighbors started really watching. Curtains moved. Doors cracked. Porch lights came on. Public attention, the thing Derek had wanted for me, bloomed around him instead. He looked at me once while they were cuffing him. Not in apology. Not in shame. In accusation. As if I had somehow done this to him by existing legally enough for the police to start noticing the next house over. That almost made me laugh. What had I done exactly? Opened the door? Produced paperwork? Maintained records? Told the truth when asked about the late-night vans? No. Derek had done this himself the moment he mistook official scrutiny for a toy. He wanted spectacle. He got inventory. They took him away just after 11. The rain had almost stopped by then. Officer Reyes came back to my porch long enough to ask if I would be available the next day for a formal statement about the delivery activity. I will, I said. Then he looked at my permit papers still in my hand and did something I appreciated deeply. He said, "For what it's worth, your records are excellent." I nodded once. "Thank you, officer." Then, because the universe occasionally allows itself irony, he glanced over his shoulder at the half-sealed garage and said, "You seem to have cleaner business habits than your neighbor." That line carried me for days. After the cars left, the street went back to stillness too quickly, the way scandal does in expensive neighborhoods. Nobody came over. Nobody asked if I was all right. No one apologized for watching. But the social current had changed. I could feel it. The next morning, Mrs. Caro brought over lemon loaf and pretended it was because she had baked too much. I accepted it because people like her are not the problem. Problem is not every neighbor who watches. Problem is the one who learns to weaponize the watching. By afternoon, word had spread farther than the block. Not about me. About Derek. Stolen parts. Suspicious deliveries. Possible resale ring. A cousin tied to a repair lot in another county. The details kept growing. I did not contribute to the gossip. I didn't need to. Reality was doing enough. 2 days later, I gave my statement. I sat in a municipal interview room with pale walls, a steel table, and a file folder thick enough to suggest Derek had not merely been sloppy. He had been busy. Reyes asked clear, methodical questions. How long had I noticed the deliveries? What time of night? How many vehicles? Had I photographed anything? Had Derek ever discussed the garage contents? I answered exactly. No more. No less. That matters. Women who are observant are often punished for sounding too prepared when men finally get caught. So I kept my voice calm, my sequence clean, and my facts boring enough to be credible. When the interview ended, Reyes closed the folder and said, "You've been documenting him for a while." "Yes." "Why?" I looked at him. Because men who monitor women's lives usually escalate when they stop getting the reaction they want. He held my gaze for a second, then nodded. That was the first time in the whole situation I felt fully seen by someone outside it. Then came the part even I hadn't expected. Derek's arrest triggered a city compliance review for the block. Apparently, when stolen auto parts start moving through a residential lane, zoning and code enforcement become curious about everything else too. And that review uncovered the second gift Derek had accidentally delivered me. His garage extension, the same structure he spent hours sitting in, half open, watching my house like a self-appointed inspector, had been built 3 feet over the recorded line. Onto my easement. I got the call from the city survey office on a Thursday. First I thought the man on the phone had the wrong parcel. He didn't. Your recorded access margin has been encroached on by a non-permitted structure, he said. Whose structure? Your neighbor's garage extension. I sat down slowly. There are moments when revenge becomes almost too perfectly assembled, and that was one of them. Not because I had engineered it. 'Cause Derek had spent months insisting my property use was illegal while literally sitting inside illegal square footage. I asked for copies of everything. Then I drove to city records and got them myself. Survey map. Encroachment notice. Permit discrepancy. Aerial overlay. Back at my kitchen table, I laid the papers out and stared at them for a long time. Then I said out loud to no one, "You stupid, arrogant man." Not angrily. Almost reverently. 'Cause there is a level of self-defeating stupidity so complete it becomes architectural. Derek's sister called me the next day. I had met her twice. Tight smile. Defensive shoulders. The sort of woman who had probably spent half her life cleaning up after a brother she resented privately and defended publicly. "He says you're pushing the city now," she said without greeting. I looked at the survey map. "I'm not pushing anything." "He says you've been trying to ruin him." "No," I said. "He did that when he called the police." She exhaled hard. "Can't you just let this go?" That question always comes, doesn't it? Not can he face consequences? Not shouldn't he have left you alone? Not why did he target you? No. Can't you let this go? 'Cause women are always expected to release pressure the moment truth becomes expensive for a man. I said, "I didn't build over my easement. I didn't store stolen parts in my garage. I didn't bring law enforcement onto the block trying to shame a neighbor. I'm not the person asking for grace here." She hung up. Good. 3 weeks later, city crews came. The demolition was partial, not total. Just enough to bring the extension back into legal compliance. But there was something deeply satisfying about watching yellow tape and municipal procedure carve righteousness out of a structure Derek had treated like a throne. I stood at my kitchen window at first. Then I stepped onto the porch. The morning was dry and bright. Workmen moved with that emotionless public efficiency that makes private humiliation feel even more final. No gloating. No performance. Just measurement, cutting, removal. Derek was out on bail by then, but I did not see him during the demolition. Smart for once. Because if he had walked onto that driveway while the structure came down, I don't know what expression I would have chosen to wear. And I prefer my worst impulses hypothetical. The neighborhood watched again, of course. This time no one pretended not to know what was happening. One of the younger couples from down the street passed my house later that evening, and the wife said, in that casual tone people use when trying to repair social distance without admitting guilt, "Looks like the city's being thorough." "Yes," I said. "It usually is once it starts looking." She nodded as if I had said something abstract. I hadn't. That was the whole lesson. People like Derek believe official attention belongs only to their targets. They never imagine systems will widen. Never imagine scrutiny might carry momentum. Never imagine that once you invite authority to a place, it may begin to notice the rot nearest the invitation. Business picked up after that. Not dramatically. Respectably. A costume director sent me 2 vintage belts. A collector from another county brought in a steamer trunk. Mrs. Caro referred a church friend with an old weekender bag. And then one afternoon Officer Reyes returned, not in uniform but in plain clothes, with his wife and a worn leather weekender she wanted restored. He handed it to me and said, "Figured if anyone on this street runs a legitimate operation, it's you." I took the bag and smiled. That sounds almost like praise. It is. His wife laughed softly. That exchange mattered more than I expected. Not because I needed police approval. Because the story had completed itself in a way an audience understands instinctively. Not only was the lie exposed, the woman it targeted became more visible as trustworthy because she survived the accusation cleanly. That is a different kind of revenge. Not destruction. Correction. By late spring, Derek's truck was gone. By summer, the house was listed. By fall, the for sale sign came down and a young family moved in. No half-open garage. No folding chair surveillance. No muttered accusations. No one counting who came to my studio. Just quiet. One evening, months later, I stood in the workshop doorway at golden hour with the smell of leather oil and old wood around me, and I looked across the street at the new family unloading bicycles. Peace had come back to the block, but not because people had become kinder, because the wrong man had finally been forced out of the center of it. He called the police to report my illegal business. He wanted the street to see me reduced. Instead, the officers noticed something illegal in his garage shortly after. And once they started looking, the rest of his life began to collapse in broad daylight. That is the thing men like Derek never understand. Suspicion is not a weapon you can always point safely. Sometimes it widens. Sometimes it circles back. And sometimes the woman you try to embarrass ends up being the most legitimate person on the block. A month before Christmas, I received one final piece of closure I never expected. A certified envelope. No return name, just legal forwarding marks. Inside was a notice that Derek had accepted a plea arrangement. Stolen property, illegal resale facilitation, code violations tied to the structure, and financial penalties severe enough that the house sale had likely not been voluntary at all. Tucked behind the notice was a copy of one of the old neighborhood complaint printouts. My address highlighted. My business circled. Handwritten note in the margin. She thinks she's smarter than everyone. I stared at that line for a long time. 'Cause buried under all the noise and contempt and male territorial nonsense, that was the truth of what he could never stand. Not the workshop. Not the deliveries. Not the permit. Not the money. That I was self-contained. That I knew what I was doing. That I could build something legal, private, and profitable without asking his approval or anybody else's. He was not policing the neighborhood. He was punishing a woman who did not seem available for management. I folded the paper carefully and put it into the same binder where I had kept the harassment log, the permit copies, the city survey, and the demolition notice. Not as a trophy. As a record. 'Cause the strongest women I know do not trust memory alone when a man finally proves them right. Later that night, I locked the studio, checked the front door, and stood for a while in the hallway between the workshop and the kitchen. My house was quiet. My books were where I left them. Permit was current. The accounts were clean. The street was still. I thought then about the first night he complained. The first photo he took. The first time he smirked when a client left my house carrying an old leather case. And I realized something I wish more women were told earlier. You do not have to become loud to defeat a man who wants to dominate you. Sometimes all you have to do is stay documented long enough for his own arrogance to introduce him properly. That was Derek's fatal mistake. Not calling the police. Calling them before he understood the difference between suspicion and evidence. If he had left me alone, maybe no one would ever have looked closely at his garage. Maybe no one would have measured the extension. Maybe he would still be sitting in that half-open structure pretending he owned the sightlines of the street. Instead, he turned official attention into a weapon. And like all weak men with borrowed power, he forgot to check what happened if the weapon turned in his hand. He wanted the whole block to see my business investigated. Fine. They did. And then they saw his life dismantled next. That is not just satisfying. That is proportion.